Thoughts on the Revival of Religion in New England, 1740, to which is prefixed a narrative of the surprising work of God in Northampton, Massachusetts, 1735, by Jonathan Edwards, pastor of the Church of Christ in Northampton, and afterwards president of Nassau Hall College, Princeton, New Jersey, published in 1742. This edition is reprinted from the Worcester edition of the President Edwards works, with some corrections of inaccuracies of style and the omission, in 3 or 4 instances, of denominational terms which might be considered reproachable to some evangelical Christians. The several parts of the work have been subdivided into appropriate heads and a new table of contents prepared. Narrative of the Surprising Work of God, 1735. General History of the Work. To the Reverend Dr. Coleman, Reverend and Honored Sir, having seen your letter to my honored Uncle William of Hatfield of July 20, wherein you informed him of the notice that has been taken of the late wonderful work of God in this and some other towns in this county by the Reverend Dr. Watts and Reverend Dr. Gizey of London, and the congregation to which the last of these preached on the monthly day of solemn prayer, as also of your desire to be made more perfectly acquainted with it by some of us on the spot, and having been since informed by my Uncle Williams that you desire me to undertake it, I would now do it in as just and faithful a manner as in me lies. The people of the county in general, I suppose, are as sober and orderly and good sort of people as in any part of New England, and I believe they have been preserved the freest by far of any part of the country from error and variety as sect and opinions. Our being so far within land, at a distance from seaports and in the corner of the country, has doubtless been one reason why we have not been so much corrupted with vice as most other parts. But without question, the religion and good order of the county and their purity in doctrine has, under God, been very much owing to the great abilities and eminent piety of my venerable and honored grandfather, Stollard. I suppose we have been the freest of any part of the land from unhappy divisions and quarrels in our ecclesiastical and religious affairs till the late lamentable Springfield contention. Footnote: the Springfield contention relates to the settlement of a minister there, which occasioned 2 warm debates between some, both pastors and people, that were for it and others that were against it, on account of their different apprehensions about his principles, and about some steps that were taken to procure his ordination. End of the footnote. We being much separated from other parts of the province, and having comparatively but little intercourse with them, have from the beginning till now always managed our ecclesiastical affairs within ourselves. It is the way in which the county, from its infancy, has gone on by the practical agreement of all, and the way in which our peace and good order has hitherto been maintained. The town of Northampton is about 82 years standing, and has now about 200 families, which mostly dwell more compactly together than any town of such size in these parts of the country, which probably has been an occasion that both our corruptions and reformations have been from time to time more swiftly propagated from one to another through the town. Take the town in general, and so far as I can judge, they are as rational and intelligent a people as most I have been acquainted with. Many of them have been noted for religion, and particularly have been remarkable for their distinct knowledge in things that relate to heart religion and Christian experience, and their great regards thereto. I am the 3rd minister that has been settled in the town. The Reverend Mr. Elijah Matter, who was the first, was ordained in July 1669. He was one whose heart was much in his work, abundant in labors for the good of precious souls. He had the high esteem and great love of his people, and was blessed with no small success. The Reverend Mr. Stoddard, who succeeded him, came first to the town the November after his death, but was not ordained until September the 11th, 1672, and died February the 11th, 1729, so that he continued in the work of the ministry here, from his first coming to town near 60 years, and as he was eminent and renowned for his great gifts and graces, so he was blessed from the beginning with extraordinary success in his ministry and the conversion of many souls. He had 5 harvests, as he called them. The first was about 57 years ago, the second about 53 years, the third about 40, the fourth about 24, the fifth and last about 18 years ago. Some of these times were much more remarkable than others, and the ingathering of souls more plentiful. Those that were about 53 and 40 and 24 years ago were much greater than either the first or the last. But in each of them I have heard my grandfather say the greater part of the young people in the town seemed to be mainly concerned for their eternal salvation. After the last of these came a far more degenerate time, at least among the young people, I suppose, than ever before. Mr. Stollard indeed had the comfort before he died of seeing a time when there was no small appearance of a divine work among some, and a considerable ingathering of souls, even after I was settled with him in the ministry, which was about 2 years before his death. And I have reason to bless God for the great advantage I had by it. In these 2 years there were near 20 that Mr. Stollard hoped to be savingly converted, but there was nothing of any general awakening. The greater part seemed to be at that time very insensible to the things of religion, and engaged in other cares and pursuits. Just after my grandfather's death, it seemed to be a time of extraordinary dullness in religion. Lasciviousness for some years greatly prevailed among the youth of the town. There were many of them very much addicted to night walking and frequenting the tavern and lewd practices, wherein some of their example exceedingly corrupted others. It was their manner very frequently to get together in assemblies of both sexes for mirth and jollity, which they called frolics, and they would often spend the greater part of the night in them, without any regard to order in the families they belonged to, and indeed family government did too much fail in the town. It was become very customary with many of our young people to be indecent in their carriage at meeting, which doubtless would not have prevailed to such a degree had it not been that my grandfather, though through his great age, though he retained his powers surprisingly to the last, was not so able to observe them. There had also long prevailed in the town a spirit of contention between two parties, into which they had for many years been divided, by which was maintained a jealous one of the other, and they were prepared to oppose one another in all public affairs. But in 2 or 3 years after Mr. Stollart's death, there began to be a sensible amendment of these evils. The young people showed more of a disposition to hearken to counsel, and by degrees left off their frolicking, and grew observably more decent in their attendance on public worship, and there were more that manifested a religious concern than there used to be. At the latter end of the year 1733, there appeared a very unusual flexibleness and yielding to advice in our young people. It had been too long their manner to make the evening after the Sabbath. Footnote: it must be noted that it has never been our measure of manner to observe the evening that follows the Sabbath, but that which precedes it as part of the holy time. End of the footnote. And after our public lecture, to be especially the times of their mirth and company keeping. But a sermon was now preached on the Sabbath before the lecture to show the evil tendency of the practice and to persuade them to reform it. And it was urged on heads of families that it should be a thing agreed upon among them to govern their families and keep their children at home at these times, and withdraw it was more privily proposed that they should meet together the next day in their several neighborhoods to know each other's minds, which was accordingly done, and the suggestion compiled with throughout the town. But parents found little or no occasion for the exercise of government in the case. The young people declared themselves convinced by what they had heard from the pulpit, and were willing of themselves to comply with the counsel that had been given, and it was immediately and, I suppose, almost universally complied with, and there was a thorough reformation of these disorders thenceforward, which has continued ever since. Presently after this, there began to appear a remarkable religious concern at a little village belonging to the congregation called Pascomuck, Pascomuck, where a few families were settled, at about 3 miles distance from the main body of the town. At this place a number of persons seemed to be savingly wrought upon. In the April following, 1734, there happened a very sudden and awful death of a young man in the bloom of his youth, who, being violently seized with a pleurism, and taken immediately very delirious, died in about 2 days, which, together with what was preached publicly on that occasion, much affected many young people. This was followed with another death of a young married woman who had been considerably exercised in mind about the salvation of her soul before she was ill, and was in great distress in the beginning of her illness, but seemed to have satisfying evidence of God's saving mercy to her before her death, so that she died very full of comfort, in a most earnest and moving manner, warning and counseling others. This seemed much to contribute to the solemnizing of the spirits of many young persons, and there began evidently to appear more of a religious concern on people's minds. In the fall of the year, I proposed to the young people that they should agree among themselves to spend the evenings after lectures in social religion, and to that end to divide themselves into several companies to meet in various parts of the town, which was accordingly done, and those meetings have been since continued, and the example imitated by elder people. This was followed by the death of an elderly person, which was attended with many unusual circumstances, by which many were much moved and affected. About this time began the great noise that was in this part of the country about Arminianism, which seemed to appear with a very threatening aspect upon the interests of a religion here. The friends of vital piety trembled for the issue, but it seemed contrary to their fears, strongly to be overruled for the promoting of religion. Many who looked on themselves as in a Christless condition seemed to be awakened by it, with fear that God was about to withdraw from the land, and that we should be given up to heterodoxy and corrupt principles, and that then their opportunity for obtaining salvation would be past, and many were brought a little to doubt about the truth of the doctrines they had hitherto been taught, seemed to have a kind of trembling fear with their doubts, lest they should be led into bypass to their eternal undoing, and they seemed with much concern and engagedness of mind to inquire what was indeed the way in which they must come to be accepted with God. There were then some things said publicly on that occasion concerning justification by faith alone. Although great faith was found with meddling with the controversy in the pulpit by such a person at that time, and though it was ridiculed by many elsewhere, yet it proved a word spoken in season here, and was most evidently attended with a very remarkable blessing of heaven to the souls of the people in this town. They received thence a general satisfaction with respect to the main thing in question, which they had been in trembling doubts and concern about, and their minds were engaged the more earnestly to seek that they might come to be accepted of God and saved in the way of the gospel, which had been made evident to them to be the true and only way. And then it was, in the latter part of December, that the Spirit of God began extraordinarily to set in and wonderfully to work among us, and there were very suddenly, one after another, 5 or 6 persons who were, to all appearance, savingly converted, and some of them wrought upon in a very remarkable manner. Particularly I was surprised with the relation of a young woman who had been one of the greatest company keepers in the whole town. When she came to me, I had never heard that she was become in any wise serious, but by conversation I then had with her, it appeared to me that what she gave an account of was a glorious work of God's infinite power and sovereign grace, and that God had given her a new heart, truly broken and sanctified. I could not then doubt of it, and have seen much in my acquaintancy with her since to confirm it. Though the work be glorious, yet I be filled with concern about the effect it might have upon others. I was ready to conclude, though too rashly, that some would be hardened by it in carelessness and looseness of life, and would take occasion from it to open their mouths in reproaches of religion. But the event was the reverse to a wonderful degree. God made it, I suppose, the greatest occasion of awakening to others of anything that ever came to pass in the town. I have had abundant opportunity to know the effect it had by my private conversation with many. The news of it seemed to be almost like a flash of lightning upon the hearts of young people all over the town and upon many others. Those persons among us who used to be furthest from seriousness and that I most feared would make an ill improvement of it seemed greatly to be awakened by it. Many went to talk with her concerning what she had met with, and what appeared in her seemed to be to the satisfaction of all that did so. Presently upon this, a great and earnest concern about the great things of religion and the eternal work became universal in all parts of the town, and among persons of all degrees and all ages. The noise among the dry bones waxed louder and louder. All other talk, but about spiritual and eternal things, were soon thrown by. All the conversations in all companies and upon all occasions was upon these things only, and less so much as was necessary for people carrying on their ordinary secular business. Other discourse than of the things of religion would scarcely be tolerated in any company. The minds of people were wonderfully taken off from the world. It was treated among us as a thing of very little consequence. They seemed to follow their worldly business more as a part of their duty than from any disposition they had to it. The temptation now seemed to lie, in the other hand, to neglect worldly affairs too much and to spend too much time in the immediate exercises of religion, which thing was exceedingly misrepresented by reports that were spread in distant parts of the land, as though the people here had wholly thrown by all worldly business and betaken themselves entirely to reading and praying and such like religious exercises. But though the people did not ordinarily neglect their worldly business, yet there then was the reverse of what commonly is. Religion was with all classes the great concern, and the world was a thing only by and by. The only thing, in their view, was to get the kingdom of heaven, and everyone appeared pressing into it. The engagedness of their hearts in this great concern could not be hid. It appeared in their very countenances. It then was a dreadful thing among us to lie out of Christ, in danger every day of dropping into hell. And what persons' minds were intent upon was to escape for their lives, and to fly from the wrath to come. All would eagerly lay hold of opportunities for their souls, and were wont very often to meet together in private houses for religious purposes, and such meetings, when appointed, were wont greatly to be thronged. There was scarcely a single person in the town, either old or young, that was left unconcerned about the great things of the eternal world. Those that were wont to be the vainest and lowest, and those that had been most disposed to think and speak slightly of vital and experimental religion, were now greatly subject to great awakenings, and the work of the conversion was carried on in a most astonishing manner, and increased more and more. Souls did, as it were, come by flocks to Jesus Christ. From day to day, for many months together, might be seen evident instances of sinners brought out of darkness into marvelous light, and delivered out of a horrible pit, and from the miry clay, and set upon a rock, with a new song of praise to God in their mouths. This work of God, as it was carried on, and the number of true saints multiplied, soon made a glorious alteration in the town, so that in the spring and summer following, 1735, the town seemed to be full of the presence of God. It never was so full of love, nor so full of joy, and yet so full of distress as it was then. There were remarkable tokens of God's presence in almost every house. It was a time of joy in families on account of salvation being brought to them, parents rejoicing over their children as newborn, and husbands over their wives, and wives over their husbands. The goings of God were then seen in the sanctuary. God's day was a delight, and his tabernacles were admirable. Our public assemblies were then beautiful. The congregation was alive in God's service, everyone earnestly intent on the public worship, every hearer eager to drink in the words of the minister as they came from his mouth. The assembly in general were, from time to time, in tears while the word was preached, some weeping with sorrow and distress, others with joy and love, others with piety and concern for the souls of their neighbors. Our public praises were then greatly enlivened. God was then served in our psalmistry, in some measure, in the beauty of holiness. It has been observable that there has been scarce any part of divine worship wherein good men among us have had grace so drawn forth, and their hearts so lifted up in the ways of God as in singing his praises. Our congregation excelled all that over. I knew in the external part of the duty before, the men generally carrying regularly and well 3 parts of music, and the women a part by themselves. But now they were evidently wont to sing with unusual elevation of heart and voice, which made the duty pleasant indeed. In all companies, on other days, on whatever occasions, persons met together. Christ was to be heard of and seen in the midst of them. Our young people, when they met, were wont to spend the time in talking of the excellency and dying love of Jesus Christ, the gloriousness of the way of salvation, the wonderful, free, and sovereign grace of God, his glorious work in the conversion of a soul, the truth and certainty of the great things of God's Word, the sweetness of the views of his perfections, etc. And even at weddings, which formerly were occasions of mirth and jollity, there was now no discourse of anything but the things of religion, and no appearance of any but spiritual mirth. Those among us that had been formerly converted were greatly enlivened and renewed with fresh and extraordinary incomes of the Spirit of God, though some much more than others, according to the measure of the gift of Christ. Many that before had labored under difficulties about their own state had now their doubts removed by more satisfying experience and more clear discoveries of God's love. When this work of God first appeared and was so extraordinarily carried on among us in the winter, others round about us seemed not to know what to make of it, and there were many that scoffed at and ridiculed it, and some compared what we called conversion to certain distempers. But it was very observable of many that occasionally came among us from abroad with disregardful hearts, that what they saw here cured them of such a temper of mind. Strangers were generally surprised to find things so much beyond what they had heard, and were wont to tell others that the state of the town could not be conceived of by those that had not seen it. The notice that was taken of it by the people that came to town on occasion of the court that sat here in the beginning of March was very observable, and those that came from the neighborhood to our public lectures were for the most part remarkably affected. Many that came to town on one occasion or another had their consciences smitten and awakened, and went home with wounded hearts and with impressions that never wore off till they had hopefully a saving issue. And those that before had serious thoughts had their awakenings and convictions greatly increased. And there were many instances of persons that came from abroad on visits or on business that had not been long here before, who were, to all appearance, savingly wrought upon, and partook of the shower of divine blessing that God rained down here, and went home rejoicing, till at length the same work began evidently to appear and prevail in several other towns in the county. In the month of March, the people in South Hadley began to be seized with deep concern about the things of religion, which very soon became universal, and the work of God has been very wonderfully there. Not much, if anything, short of what it has been here in proportion to the size of the place. About the same time, it began to break forth in the west part of Suffield, where it has also been very great, and it soon spread into all parts of the town. It next appeared at Sunderland, and soon overspread the town, and I believe was for a season not less remarkable than it was here. About the same time it began to appear in the part of Deerfield called Green River, and afterwards filled the town, and there has been a glorious work there. It began also to be manifested in the south part of Hatfield, in a place called The Hill. And after that, the whole town, in the second week in April, seemed to be seized, as it were at once, with concern about the things of religion, and the work of God has been great there. There has been also a very general awakening at West Springfield and Long Meadow, and in Enfield there was for a time a pretty general concern among some that before had been very loose persons. About the same time that this appeared in Enfield, the Reverend Mr. Bull of Westfield informed me that there had been a great change there, and that more had been done in 1 week there than in 7 years before. Something of this work likewise appeared in the first precinct of Springfield, principally in the north and south extremities of the parish. And in Hadley, Old Town, there gradually appeared so much of a work of God on souls as at other time would have been thought worthy of much notice. For a short time there was also a very great and general concern of the like nature at Northfield, and wherever this concern appeared, it seemed not to be in vain, but in every place God brought saving blessings with him and his word, attended with his Spirit, as we have all reason to think, returned not void. It might well be said at that time in all parts of the county, "Who are these that fly as a cloud, and as doves to the windows?" As what other towns heard of and found in this was a great means of awakening them, so our hearing of such a swift and extraordinary propagation and extent of this work did doubtless for a time serve to uphold the work among us. The continual news kept alive the talk of religion, and did greatly quicken and rejoice the hearts of God's people, and much awakened those that looked on themselves as still left behind, and made them the more earnest that they might share in the great blessing that others had obtained. This remarkable pouring out of the Spirit of God, which thus extended from one end to the other of this county, was not confined to it, but many places in Connecticut have partaken in the same mercy, as, for instance, the first parish in Windsor, under the pastoral care of Reverend Mr. Marsh, was thus blessed about the same time as we in Northampton. While he had no knowledge of each other's circumstances, there had been a very great ingathering of souls to Christ in that place, and something considerable of the same work began afterwards in East Windsor, my honored father's parish, which has in times past been a place favored with mercies of this nature above any on this western side of New England, excepting Northampton, there having been 4 or 5 seasons of the pouring out of the Spirit to the general awakening of the people there since my father's settlement among them. There was also the last spring and summer a wonderful work of God carried on at Coventry under the ministry of the Reverend Mr. Meacham, Meacham. I had opportunity to converse with some of the Coventry people, who gave me a very remarkable account of the surprising change that appeared in the most rude and vicious persons there. A similar work was also very great at the same time in a part of Lebanon, called the Crate, where the Reverend Mr. Wheelock, a young gentleman, is lately settled, and there has been much of the same at Durham, under the ministry of Reverend Mr. Chansey, and to appearance no small ingathering of souls there, and likewise among many of the young people in the first precinct in Stratford under the ministry of the Reverend Mr. Gould, where the work was much promoted by the remarkable conversion of a young woman that had been a great company keeper, as it was here. Something of this work appeared in several other towns in those parts, as I was informed when I was there the last fall. And we have since been acquainted with something very remarkable of this nature at other parish in Stratford called Ripton, under the pastoral care of the Reverend Mr. Mills. And there was a considerable revival of religion last summer at New Haven, Old Town, as I was once and again informed by the Reverend Mr. Noyes, Noyes, the minister there, and by others, and by a letter which I very lately received from Mr. Noyes, and also by information we have had otherwise. This flourishing of religion still continues and has lately much increased. Mr. Noyes writes that many this summer have been added to the church, and particularly mentions several young persons that belong to the principal families of that town. There has been a degree of the same work at a part of Guilford and very considerable at Mansfield, under the ministry of the Reverend Mr. E. Williams, and an unusual religious concern at Tolad, and something of it at Hebron and Bolton. There was also no small effusion of the Spirit of God in the North Parish in Preston, in the eastern part of Connecticut, which I was informed of and saw something of it when I was the last autumn at the house and in the congregation of the Reverend Mr. Lord, the minister there, who, with the Reverend Mr. Owen of Groton, came up hither in May the last year on purpose to see the work of God here, and having heard various and contradictory accounts of it, were careful when they were here to inform and satisfy themselves, and to that end particularly conversed with many of our people, which they declared to be entirely to their satisfaction, that the one half had not been told them, nor could be told them. Mr. Lord told me that when he got home he informed his congregation of what he had seen, and that they were greatly affected with it, and that it proved the beginning of the same work among them, which prevailed till there was a general awakening and many instances of persons who seemed to be remarkably converted. I also have lately heard that there has been something of the same work at Woodbury. But this shower of divine blessing has been yet more extensive. There was no small degree of it in some parts of New Jersey, as I was informed when I was at New York, in a long journey I took at that time of the year for my health, by some people of New Jersey, which I saw, especially the Reverend Mr. William Tennant, a minister who seemed to have such things much at heart, told me of a very great awakening of many in a place called the Mountains, under the ministry of one Mr. Cross, and of a very considerable revival of religion in another place, under the ministry of his brother, the Reverend Mr. Gilbert Tennant, and also at another place under the ministry of a very pious young gentleman, a Reformed Dutch minister, whose name, as I remember, was spelled Frelinghuyen. This seems to have been a very extraordinary dispensation of providence. God has, in many respects, gone out of and much beyond his usual and ordinary way. The work in this town and some others about us have been extraordinary on account of the universality of it, affecting all classes, sober and vicious, high and low, rich and poor, wise and unwise. They reach the most considerable families and persons, to all appearance, see as much as others. In former awakenings, the bulk of the young people have been greatly affected, but old men and little children have been so now. Many of the last have, of their own accord, formed themselves into religious societies in different parts of the town. A loose, careless person could scarcely find a companion in the whole neighborhood, and if there was any one that seemed to remain senseless or unconcerned, it would be spoken of as a strange thing. This dispensation has also appeared extraordinary in the numbers of those on whom we have reason to hope it has had a saving effect. We have about 620 communicants, which include almost all our adult persons. The church was very large before, but persons never thronged into it as they did in the late extraordinary time. Our seasons of celebrating the Lord's Supper were 8 weeks asunder, and I received into our communion about 100 before one sacrament, and 80 of them at one time, whose appearancy when they presented themselves together to make an open, explicit profession of Christianity was very affecting to the congregation. I took in near 60 before the next sacramental day, and I had very sufficient evidence of the conversion of their souls through divine grace, though it is not the custom here, as it is in many other churches in the country, to make a credible relation of their inward experiences the ground of admission to the Lord's Supper. I am far from pretending to be able to determine how many have lately been the subject of such mercy, but if I may be allowed to declare anything that appears to me probable in a thing of this nature. I hope that more than 300 souls were savingly brought home to Christ in this town in the space of half a year. How many more, I don't guess. And about the same number of males as females, which, by what I have heard Mr. Stoddard say, was far from what has been usual in years past. For he observed that in his time many more women were converted than men. Those of our young people that are on other accounts most respected are mostly, as I hope, truly pious and leading persons in the way of religion. Those that are formerly loose young persons are generally, to all appearance, become true lovers of Christ and God, and spiritual in their dispositions. And I hope that by far the greater part of persons in this town, about 16 years of age, are such as have the saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. And so by what I have heard, I suppose it is, in some other places, particularly at Sutherland and South Hadley. This has also appeared to be a very extraordinary dispensation, in that the Spirit of God has so much extended not only his awakening, but regenerating influences, both to elderly persons and also to those that are very young. It has been a thing hitherto rarely heard, of that any were converted past middle age. But now we have the same ground to think that many such have in this time been savingly changed, as that others have been so in more early years. I suppose there were upwards of 50 persons converted in this town above 40 years of age, and more than 20 of them above 50, and about 10 of them above 60, and 2 of them above 70 years of age. It has hitherto been looked on as a strange thing, when any have seemed to be savingly wrought upon and remarkably changed in their childhood. But now I suppose nearly 30 were to appearances so wrought upon between 10 and 14 years of age, and 2 between 9 and 10, and 1 about 4 years of age. And because, I suppose, this last will be the most difficult believed, I shall hereafter give a particular account of it. The influences of God's Spirit have also been very remarkable on children in some other places, particularly at Sutherland and South Hadley, and the west part of Suffield. There are several families in this town that are all hopefully pious, yet there are several numerous families in which I think we have reason to hope that all the children are truly godly, and that most of them have lately become so, and there are very few houses in the whole town into which salvation has not lately come in one or more instances. There are several colored persons that, from what was seen in them then and what is discernible in them since, appear to have been truly born again in the late remarkable season. God has also seemed to have gone out of his usual way in the quickness of his work and the swift progress his Spirit has made in his operation on the hearts of many. 'Tis wonderful that persons should be so suddenly and yet so greatly changed. Many have been taken from a loose and careless way of living, and seized with strong convictions of the guilt and misery, and in a very little time old things have passed away, and all things have become new with them. God's work has also appeared very extraordinary in the degrees of the influences of the Spirit, both in the degree of awakening and conviction, and also in the degree of saving light and love and joy that many have experienced. It has also been very extraordinary in the extent of it, and in its being so swiftly propagated from town to town. In former times of the pouring out of the Spirit of God on this town, though in some of them it was very remarkable, yet it reached no further than this town. The neighboring towns all around continued unmoved. The work of God's Spirit seemed to be at its greatest height in this town in the former part of the spring, in March and April, at which time God's work in the conversion of souls was carried on among us in so wonderful a manner that, so far as I, by looking back, can judge from a particular acquaintancy I have had with souls in this work, it appears to me probably to have been at the rate at least of 4 persons a day, or near 30 in a week, take one with another, for 5 or 6 weeks together, when God in so remarkable a manner took the work into his own hands, there was as much done in a day or two as at ordinary times with all endeavors that men can use, and with such a blessing as we commonly have is done in a year. I am very sensible how apt many would be, if they should see the account I have here given, presently to think with themselves that I am very fond of making a great many converts, and of magnifying and agorizing the matter, and to think that, for want of judgment, I take every religious pang and enthusiastic conceit for saving conversion, and I do not wonder much if they should be apt to think so. And for this reason I have forborne to publish an account of this great work of God, though I have often been urged to it. But having now, as I thought, a special call to give an account of it upon mature consideration, I thought it might not be beside my duty to declare this amazing work, as appeared to me to be indeed divine, and to conceal no part of the glory of it, leaving it with God to take care of the credit of his own work, and running the venture of any censorious thoughts which might be entertained of me to my disadvantage, that distant persons may be under as great advantage as may be to judge for themselves of this matter. I would be a little more large and particular. End of the first part, Chapter 1, having been read by Peter John Percy, he's also known as Brian Dean. None of my audios are copyrighted. Please feel free to make as many copies as you desire to the glory of God.